Okay, good afternoon. It's Friday, February 16th, 3 p.m. info briefing agenda. Okay, we're at Dusty Capitol, room 224. Okay, Labor and Technology Committee. And the agenda has been posted for several weeks. And the purpose of this informational briefing is to discuss the contract process for large IT systems. Specific discussion points may include a certain failed contract, lessons learned, and recommended changes to prevent problems in the future. Okay, so there will be a hard stop at 4:30. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So we have the CIO. Are you ready to present? Or why don't we have the comptroller maybe go ahead and introduce everyone who's here?
Hello, Chair, Vice Chair. Thank you very much for having us here today before the Senate Committee on Labor and Technology. My name is Keith Regan. I'm the State Comptroller for the State of Hawaii, Department of Accounting and General Services. Joining us today, per the committee's request, is our Chief Information Officer, Doug Murdoch, the Director of the Department of Budget and Finance, Louis Salaveria, the former Comptroller and current Deputy Superintendent for the Department of Education, Kurt Otaguro, the Hawaii Housing Finance and Development Corporation Executive Assistant Craig Hirai, and the IT Governance Officer for the State of Hawaii, Todd Omura, who will also be talking about the IV&V process. Senators, I just want to thank you for inviting us to share about the contracting process for large information technology systems. We're prepared to share where we went astray in last contracts, our lessons learned, systemic challenges, and our recommended actions to prevent the same problems from occurring with future contracts. We appreciate the guidance that you've provided on how we can make good use of this hour and a half, and we'll be very clear and succinct with all of our answers. A new enterprise financial management system is critically important to the state. The Executive Committee is aware that we have a responsibility to use Hawaii taxpayer dollars prudently. We hope our discussion today will give this committee a better understanding of how we can move forward as a state. Large IT projects, they're difficult, they're complex, and they're very difficult to execute. We'll be very candid, as I mentioned, and forthcoming so that we can find solutions together. With that, Chair, as you requested, I'd like to invite the Chief Information Officer, Mr. Murdoch, to come on up.
Okay. And thank you very much, CIO. You did provide us with a slide deck. I believe it's 40-something slides. Okay, so we just to ensure that we have good discussion. I'm just going to ask you to go over your slide deck, and we can go ahead and start on slide 7 if possible.
Great, that was the plan. So if we could go to slide 7.
Okay, thank you.
It's a quick summary of the enterprise financial system process that we went through. RFP development started in May of 2020, which was a little after the pandemic started, I think, a couple months. We were ending or finishing the time and leave system, so we were trying to get ready to start the next system. The RFP wasn't released, though, until November 2020, because we took our time getting feedback from DAGS and BNF and the departments. There were surveys sent out and discussions that were had. So it took a while. We also had it reviewed by Gartner and Infotech, who are professional services organizations, and some other things were done. So the contract was finally awarded almost a year later to LSI using SAP software. So we did reference checks at that time, and they passed the reference checks in November of 2021. We started having serious contract disputes beginning in May of 2022. Interestingly, and it may have been a factor, at this time, the state of Nevada was terminating their contract with LSI to build a substantially similar system. And we were aware of that and tracking that. LSI informed us that they could not meet cost, schedule, or performance parameters in July of 2022.
Sorry, Doug.
Yes.
So maybe just real briefly, since it's just a small group here, and questions maybe you can ask questions anytime. So on May, so when the serious contract dispute discussions began in May of 2022, how much did we spend at this point in time, roughly?
At that point in time, I'm going to estimate that we had paid them about $2 million, maybe $2.5 million.
And what consisted of the $2 million?
Every contract that we do normally has deliverables, such as the development plan or, you know, other documents that they have to do. There's a data plan, there's a extract, transform, load plan. So all of these various plans are there. And so we're asking them to do plans. And sometimes they're deliverables of a plan to set up the system environments that are on the computer, the test development, you know, an actual operational environment. So that was one that we paid for. Even having their kickoff meeting would be a potential deliverable, you know, for an IT project. So each of these items might have an amount of pay that's relatively equal to what we think they would spend to do that work.
So what was the specific items that started this whole discussion?
The disputed items, there were 5. The first one was that part of the reason this contractor was selected was that they had indicated they were going to use local vendors, local IT contractors to support them. And, you know, as near as we could tell from talking to the local vendors, that had not happened. And we felt this was very important because our local IT vendors understand the environment and working with the people, and they even run some of the financial system stuff that we have now, such as the data mart and some of the mainframe work. So it was important for them to integrate these people into their process, and they weren't doing it. Second thing we had was that there were deliverables that were of poor quality that we weren't paying. We had not paid them for, so there were some that were delivered and not accepted. And if you look at the long detailed timetable that's later on in the slideshow that I'm not going to go to unless we need to, it does indicate whether it was delivered, not delivered, and whether it was accepted or not accepted. The third thing was they had a requirement to create an escrow account. The fourth thing was a discussion of how they were going to do the interfaces with other financial systems. And then the fifth item, and probably the most critical item, although subcontractors was, you know, critical success, was there's a process that we always go through called extract, transform, and load. And that's taking all the data from the old system, transforming it into what the new system needs, and then loading it into the new system. And this extract, transform, and load process really needs to start almost on day one. The discussions about it should start and the planning should start. And we just weren't seeing any movement in that direction. And when we asked them how they were going to do it, their methodology seemed very inadequate. You know, they were going to use Excel spreadsheets, and I don't even think all the data would fit on an Excel spreadsheet. So in that case, they would use Access. But there are better tools for doing ETL. And the important thing about ETL is it has to happen over and over and over again throughout the process of the contract as they're, you know, making changes to the system and redoing how things are going to work. So we know that this is so important. It was also one of the reasons the unemployment insurance contract stopped, is because that vendor did not have a good ETL plan. And when we see that from an ETS perspective, we know that it's going to be a hard go.
So when was that identified as a problem, and what was done to try to rectify it?
That one was done in May, early May of 2021,
21.
I think, by our 2022, by our program manager, May of 2022. May 26th is one of the emails I'm looking at. Yeah, I think only 6 months after they started. So we had given them a notice to cure, basically, which is you need to fix this. And then discussion started about how or when they were going to fix it. And some of them they fixed, like the issue with some of the deliverables, and a couple other things they were working on. We weren't really satisfied at all with the ETL, to the point where the program manager, Brian Fry, was starting to write his own ETL plan of what he wanted the vendor to do, because they couldn't deliver a plan of how they were going to do it that was acceptable to us. So a lot of effort was going into coaching them up and getting them going. And I think they started to realize, or maybe they already knew, that they weren't prepared to do the amount of work that was going to take to successfully complete the project. And it was about that time that they started to come with the notion that, we need a contract change order, we need more money and more time and maybe even less scope. So anytime you hear that this early in a project, you feel like the vendor is maybe bit off more than they can chew, or they're being disingenuous.
So Doug, what you're describing right now, what bullet point are we at then?
Serious contract disputes discussions began in May of 2022. So that's the fourth bullet point. And then the fifth one is in July, where they said they couldn't meet cost, schedule, or performance. Then in August and September, we were discussing alternatives, like what would it cost and what would we take out of the contract, because we'll try and push them back to the original contract price rather than add more money, because we don't have more money. So we would have said, okay, we have 16.8 million or 17 million. What can you do for that? If we reduce scope, how can we make that happen? So we had to do that on the payroll contract and the time and leave contract. Sometimes it's just the way things work out, but we try and stay within the contract budget, and both of those programs did stay within the contracted budget. But again, it was fairly clear that they were looking to increase the price and the time and reduce their work scope. And so I think in August, they did a briefing to the executive committee. Comptroller was pretty upset with the briefing because they were promising to do less for more money, and we were finding that to be unacceptable. So there was more discussion in September. I think in August, they did not even give us what the number would be in terms of what the cost was. And then sometimes they would say, oh, we'll do it. We'll take care of it. We'll comply with the contract. And then later on, they would say, oh, wait, we can't. We need to redo this. They changed program managers a few times. I think they had 3 program managers almost by this point in time. And it may have been this ongoing discussion seemed to happen with every new program manager, that the program managers didn't think he could deliver, at the contracted price. So
is there anything in your contract language that says if you don't deliver X, Y, or Z, especially if you say this extract, transform, load is like primary, and even getting a system up and running, that there are some triggers to say, you don't do this by such and such date, then we'll terminate the contract. It seems like you waited a long time.
I think there's a tendency to try and work things out with the contractor without getting to blows. It's a big contract and we're trying to work it out. We want to be successful. The business is very interested in replacing. They need this business capability desperately because the systems we have are old, and we're doing a great job of keeping them alive. My people do a wonderful job with that, but it really hamstrings the business when they're having to use Famous or Data Mart to do work. So we're doing everything we can to try and recover this contract and make it go forward. And so that a lot of the negotiation that happened, from July through probably November is, okay, how can we save this? We want to save it and not end it. So I totally understand, the perspective that we should try to get them online. And this does happen, it's not unusual. These big system contracts are very complicated. Probably 60% of them succeed across the country. The other 40% fail sometimes in big ways.
I guess the question is lessons learned that, okay, we know that it's really complex. We know we've got to transform your business operations. We know all of that. And yet you have scope of work that have deliverables. That if they're not delivering, there must be trigger points to say, correct or not. Or if you say, okay, we'll let you adjust and we'll have faith in you, there should be another trigger point that says, but if you can't, we claw back. And something like that in terms of at least having some kind of deterrence to not just hanging and stringing along versus let's get something going here or not.
That's right. And we have put together a quality assurance program for system development and management and operations that includes, among other things, some, on-ramps and off-ramps for what you have to go, and maybe there need to be some project approvals at different phase gates throughout the process. So right now, once we approve a project at the very beginning, we don't stop it from the PAC perspective, which is the governor's approval process for systems. So I think we're going to have to add some of these phase gates to PAC, and ETL will probably be one of them, that we have a viable ETL project. And then the other thing is in the IV&V system that we have, which has independent verification and validation, they're probably too quick to mark things red, and we really need to have meaning to what red is. And so we're planning on changing the IV&V process so that when they make something red because of the vendor's actions, we should take contract action. There should be a notice to cure, a stop work order, a suspension of the contract, something serious that says you're red in an area that's unacceptable. So we're going to make meaningful changes in the way we process these big systems to make sure that we don't have problems again.
Notice in the IV, we had red, and it was like a report. Okay, you're in red. Nothing was done. So I mean, what is that corrective action where you're red? So IV says you better do something about this, and here are some suggested actions to be taken. Is it a report? Is a report, and you just go along to the next phase?
We did have recommendations from our IV&V in this case. They came onto the project a little late. They didn't start until July. So they came in when we were in the middle of trying to turn things around. By about September, they had recommended that we either need to restart the program, and just stop the current contract, or find a new way to go forward. Right. So we did, as a group that involved the prior administration, was me and Craig and Kurt, looked at ways to go forward with what LSI said it would take to finish the contract. We were looking at a number between 10 and 20 million more on top of the 17 that we had already spent. We had questions about whether we could increase the contract scope that much, since that wasn't part of the original RFP. But in the end, we were able, with Governor Ige's approval, to have $9 million of ARPA money made available to try and negotiate an improved contract situation so we could try and build out the system, because it was important to the business, and Governor Ige knew that it was critical that we try to finish this. But at that point in my mind, it was very difficult to sign a contract with LSI and give them more money for work that they probably already should have been doing.
Sounds like the construction contracts will be coming low, and then change order. Seemed like that's kind of what the situation you were in. It's okay, we did this, and the scope is there, but you're adding more. And but this one, you're doing the same thing.
It was essentially, we weren't really adding. We really almost were talking like there was no contract. That the two of us did not have an agreement on what the contract was about. So I've gone back through the contract. I've gone back through the questions people asked about the contract. I have no doubt that what we were asking for was work they should have done. And nonetheless, we were trying to salvage, completion of the business system if we could. So that was the work we were doing. And I think the new administration came in, the new business director started looking at, where we were at. They had a similar concern that there was a need to replace the business system and to try. So we were taking a hard look at the IV&V reports and looking at options of how we could go. And it took 3 or 4 months from the time they came on board, and they obviously have tons of other things to do as new directors and departments, and legislature was starting. But after, I think starting in February and March, I think the decision was made that we needed to terminate this contract and start over, because we just didn't see a way forward. At this point, we're also aware that first of all, the Nevada contract had been canceled, and that we had a contract at DOT Highways for their financial management system that was over a year behind schedule. So we didn't see this vendor being able to deliver on schedule the product that we needed. It became hard to see the future. Yeah.
So Doug, so throughout this whole timeline, who do you report to, or who did you report to it during this whole, every single part of the timeline that's from May 2020 up until March 23 when the decision was made? Ultimately, who do you report to?
As the CIO, I report to the governor, but in this process, we had formed an executive committee under the governor's guidance to try to implement the system, and the executive committee included the budget director or the finance director and the comptroller and me. And then we had, staff on our teams that were working it as well.
So the previous administration, the previous governor knew some of the issues that were occurring with the contractor. And once there was a change in administrations in December of 2022, how quickly did you get that particular team, the new administration, up to speed on what was happening?
I think we met the first time in December. So shortly after the inauguration, and then we met in January, February, and March after that. So we were pretty quick to be back together, and I think we even were holding weekly meetings for a while, or bi-weekly meetings, to try and find resolution or find a path forward for success.
Sorry, you may continue.
Oh, okay. So let's go to the next slide. I think we've covered that, what happened there. There's a very detailed RFP timeline in the slides that, has probably 20 or 30 dates on it. And then there's a 4-page detailed timeline of the actual contract in there. So I won't go over all of that, but I'll talk about what we've been doing since the termination of the contract. We right away got on the idea of risk reduction, things that we could do better to be prepared for a couple of reasons. One is, we want to show the next vendor that we're ready. And we need to show them that we've fixed anything that was a systemic weakness on our side. So for example, we are doing proofs of concept to extract the data out of the current COBOL database, which is very difficult. And we've successfully done that. So that's good not only for showing the next vendor that we're ready, but also for anytime an emergency happens and the database goes down, it would help us, bring Famous back up. So we're looking at all the business documentation that currently exists.
Before you start on
Sure.
the corrections, I just wanted to hear from the from Kurt and Greg, because I just want to know what was going awry that they know about, and that we're covering it in the corrective action.
Yep.
So for
Who
Gags,
do you want to call?
comptroller first, and then Vianette, the former comptroller. Sorry. This is problems area. Problem identification. Prior comptroller.
Yes.
So how did you see the contract? And you were on the small plan, the executive team, but in terms of DAGs being the customer basically of this
Right.
technology.
The way, in my recollection, the program or the project was structured, you have a program lead, and that would be ETS, since they were the contract administrator, right? So they signed the contract. The way, and I'm sure former budget and finance director Hawai'i would say, then we became the functional leads. So you need users that look at the business process. You have the technologists, obviously, that would procure for the technology itself. And then, of course, the platform that goes along with it, and project management, right? That could be on either side.
So who did what
So
in this?
Doug was the contract administrator, and he had a team, I think it was called Enterprise Program Management, that was formed actually previously with the payroll conversion and then the time and leave project. And so concurrent with that, that as the time and leave program or project was in its third phase, I believe, that team started the RFP development. Keep in mind that while that was started in May of 2020, the state was in a lockdown in March. And so the resources were not as available for teleworking. That's no excuse, but the timing was bad. And it took different focus, yet the directive of the CIO was we need to get this thing moving. And so we did our best as a team to get it through that. But we were resource constrained in the very beginning for obvious reasons. But where...
So OETS was the project manager, but DAGS having the...
A functional side. So for example,
What is a functional?
Functional means accounting is accounting, right? And so if you I had to dig back some of the modules that were purchased or going to be purchased, right? So you have accounts payable, accounts receivable, inventory management for state assets. Of course, you had the procurement, which we weren't going to get done.
So you guys
Payments.
are the users.
Yeah. Lease accounting, right? Fixed assets. Craig would be on the bonds management, bonds tracking, budget, that kind of things. So each subject matter area would have to be engaged in that aspect. And so on DAG's side, we were held responsible for the formation of a uniform chart of accounts. And that's just a foundational language that we want to establish in all accounting systems, because as the legislature appropriates funds, you want to make sure that if it's appropriated to a specific type of use, that all departments across the state use that same language and account for it, so we can report back not only to the governor, but to the legislature how we expended those funds. Without a uniform chart of accounts, I don't care what accounting system you have, it'd be difficult to answer your questions as to how much we spent for something. And it can get very granular. So at the state level, the uniform chart of accounts was established for departments, but there was flexibility in terms of the layering of that number string where you could get down to granularity, like in a DOE, down to a classroom if we wanted to track expenses that way. So at some point, it was mandatory that departments comply with a new format. And then there was optional for those departments that want to go into more detail.
So, in coming up with that contract, the original, where was DAGS in that in terms of developing the scope of work for the RFP that went out to get the contract?
Fortunately, the enterprise program management, my recollection is they started the RFP process. They probably had templates from previously for boilerplate things. They did reach out to different areas to compile a list of requirements. Whether those requirements were sufficient, I couldn't say. And to the extent in which what I've learned in the state is there's no one person knows the entire answer. And so to get a comprehensive RFP would require a lot of dialogue with a lot of people. Even in DAGS or BNF, we have specific assignments and subject matter expertise by that.
So all of them were involved in the
I don't know. I don't know that part of it when in the RFP gathering to come up with the requirements for that. I was not involved in that aspect. We were involved at the end when it was all compiled as to review it.
Review the RFP or review once the contractor or the vendor was selected?
We had an opportunity to review the RFP. It was big, a lot of pages. So whether I looked at every single page and understood every single line, yeah.
Accounting and whoever was involved, how many divisions were involved?
Well, our accounting division, DAG's accounting was involved. But again, resource constraint. And that's, if you're gonna look for any singular similarity, it's the state's resource constraint to do the work and do a project. So.
Okay, so so then the RFP, the scope of work was done by people who worked on the other the time and leave and those projects. Is that right?
Yes.
And they're all from DAG's accounting or some parts of DAG's accounting.
They had a dedicated team that the legislature, thanks to the governor, did fund. I can't remember exactly how many, maybe it was 10 people in different aspects. I don't know if they were all filled at the time, but there were people that were assigned to actually just run the project. And the CEO is correct. There has to be a dedicated team to tackle a project of this magnitude.
And they followed the project all the way through, or I think what we're seeing is the problem was on the tail end of.
No, the project,
user-
no, to me, the problem is upfront.
So,
The end user should have a big say in terms of the
but you said they
requirements.
did have a say.
They had some say. And the level of detail that you gotta get to, this project should be driven by the users. Now, that means that they have to have specific people dedicated to that, business analysts, project managers, and that sort. But ETS was the only organization that was structured that way. And so I believe the CIO took that on because he had that team. But unlike converting of a very simple system, this required interfacing to every single state agency because of the breadth of what we were trying to accomplish. And that's a tall order to fill. And so we did our best as DAGs to reach out to the different users that we believe had an impact, a stake. But I know that we did not reach out, or ETS could not reach out to every single other department. And that's the difference that this state operates its systems on and its accounting processes. They're very individualized by department. I believe the theory was to bring it all together like payroll, which could be classified as a successful conversion, although there are a lot of yelling and screaming along the way and some unhappy people. But the end result is the CIO was able to convert the state into one payroll system. Same theory.
You think that that's a good thing, and is what needs to be done looking back, Monday morning quarterbacking, what was missing and what should be in place?
I believe as the vendors were selected or reviewed, I believe that the LSI organization did not do their homework to understand how this state operates. And it was very apparent in the very beginning as they called their meetings, and they'd call a meeting of 50 guys and asking specific questions when you know that we may not have the right person at the meeting, but they would not provide questions up front in advance so we could prepare. And that's normally how the state would operate. So we can find the answer to the question. We got to get to the subject matter expert. So I believe LSI had a false understanding that BNF or DAGs ran everything. And that's not quite the case, right? As you very well know. And so their project methodology clashed with the state's methodology or ETS's project methodology. And that's where it started from the very beginning, from my recollection. And so we as a state did complain to the vendor that the head project manager or the lead project manager they assign is not doing their job.
So Kurt, which part of the timeline did this start occurring then, if it started early on?
Right at the beginning of once the contract was awarded and teams were assigned and LSI made promises, they called project meetings. I can't remember exactly what date that would be.
When the contract was awarded?
So the contract was awarded in November 2021, but according to the timeline that was provided, it was 6-7 months down the road. It wasn't in the very beginning. So
Well, yeah, whenever the team started to actually do the project discussions, is what I recall. Prior to that, it was all contract negotiations and dotting the i's and crossing the t's.
So you're saying the PUCA was between November 2020 and 2021 when the RFP was being developed. There should have been users at the front end saying this is what the system should look like or is and should be changed. What is, when you're saying that the RFP should have selected a vendor that knew more about the system or system to be?
I believe that, and I can only recall my dialogues with the budget and finance people, so specifically the former comptroller, Rod Becker, and his requirements for bonds. And he was not consulted. for his requirements, which we knew was a big issue that we wanted to address. As a good example. And it wasn't until we bought the system that he did get engaged. And then, of course, he would have a lot of questions. And that's the difference, right? I think the state needs to migrate from this mentality of I'm going to customize everything my way. This is the way I do it. So your system needs to work my way. And so that change management didn't occur until after. And change management means we need to accept the fact that we're going to change our business process. There's no way that we can do what we've done before. And the vendor said 70% is on the rack, meaning we're just buying it off the shelf. 20% thereabouts would be configurable, is what the large percentage is, meaning we can change the knobs and attributes, tweak it. And maybe 10% or less should be customized, right? So when you go into a project of that nature, the staff need to understand that, and the staff needs to be willing to accept those changes. Whether that buy-in occurred or whether they nodded and said everything is okay, well, I don't know. And I would take responsibility for some of that, trying to convince users, the people, that you're going to make a change. And so our inability to do better change management on the front end and explain how this thing is going to impact you before you even get to the technology is what needs to be done.
So do you think, with the experience of the last 2 years, that there is this acceptance of a change management orientation among the staff who have to use this new system?
It's hard for staff that do the work to accept the change. Some of it is that by statute, this is what they know. Signing DAGs, paper with blue ink, it's not a statute, but that is the way they want to see it because that's the way they do it, and to change would be an impact to their efficiency. But it's difficult, but that's what projects have to take. It starts not on the technology side, it starts with the people side and the process. It's always the people first. It's about leadership and leading the sales pitch, so to speak, the reasons why we got to change and what that means. More importantly than why I got to change is what that means, that we got to change our processes. And some will feel I need the paper. Some will feel we just took away my authority. I mean, there's just a lot of reasons why people will feel uncomfortable with change, a disruption, which it is. When you introduce technology, there is going to be disruption. Now, it's a matter of how we manage through that expectation, in my humble opinion.
If we don't have that change, business change management orientation, or at least the last couple of years of experience going through it, then it's kind of throwing money out the door, even if we have technology. So what have you learned so that you can, pass the baton? But what is it there that at least to move forward, because we still have to put a system in place, and we want a working system.
Yes, the state does need a new system. In shortfall, we need people. Dedicated
Have you
people.
done anything with that? Have that baton handed to you?
Yes, so thank you very much, Chair and Vice Chair, and I want to thank the former comptroller for all that he said. One of the big lessons learned, as we've been discussing, has been putting an emphasis on change management, because as was discussed, we have a system that's been in place for 55 years, built on top of processes that were in place 50 years before that. So for 100 years now, the state has been doing business sort of the same way. And to the former comptroller's point, a lot of emphasis needs to be put on bringing people along, right? To accept change and to understand change, understand the why behind the change. And so we do have a change management team led by Doug Murata and his people, who is bringing forward an approach and a strategy that will help us address some of these challenges that we faced with the previous iteration of this project. So a lot of focus and attention is going to be put on making sure that change management is key to this particular project as we go forward.
So is this
That's the plan.
before you go out to another RFP?
We're
or
doing
what
it now. We're actually doing it
So the
now.
change management is your own team
Yes.
that you develop in DAGS?
That's correct.
And they are part of developing the scope of work, or what on the RFP if you're looking for $60 million?
They're integral. But let me just say that the staff resides within ETS, so they're part of the CIO's team. We've been very fortunate that the CIO has allowed those resources to be, I don't want to say dedicated, but pretty much dedicated to us, to the DAG side, right? The functional side of this project. So we've been working very closely with them on putting together that plan and ensuring that as we go forward, the end user voice, right, that we've been talking about, that you've heard the former comptroller mention, is very clear and a very important part of the requirement gathering and the build out of those requirements that will be in the actual RFP going forward. So a lot of emphasis, a lot of focus has been placed on that. We've actually enlisted the help of a local accounting firm by the name of Spire, who has already held over 90 meetings with key stakeholders within the departments. We've met with more than 100 plus end users. These are people that are in the fiscal operations, the accounting side of the house, if you will, for all of the departments to discuss, socialize the uniform chart of accounts. You heard Kurt was talking a little bit about, speaking the same language, right, in terms of accounting, so that it's uniform across the whole organization. That was the initial push as part of those meetings. But during those meetings, we also talked about what does the future look like for the state under a new financial management system, right? A new way of thinking, new way of approaching the way that we do business. There is a huge appetite for change out there within the departments. We're actually really excited to hear that news, because we thought, much like, and this may have been different, right, when the former comptroller was there, but now people are asking us, when is this going to happen? When can we, have a different way of doing business? They're hungry for it.
And
So-
is that within your own department as well?
It is, absolutely. So it's our own people, but the exciting part is that it's the departments as well. So their financial teams, their accounting, the people who are doing accounting out there in the field within those departments, they are desperate for us to move forward with this modernization effort. And they want to be involved. They're excited about being involved. I think part of the key, though, in this whole thing is going to be making sure that we properly augment their staffing needs, right? And by that, what I mean is when we ask the department, hey, we need these 2 people, or, we need these 3 people to be dedicated to the overall project going forward, because they're key functional users of the system, that we need to be able to provide resources back to the department. So the individual isn't worried about, my gosh, I still got my 40-hour work to do when I go back. How can I do that? How can I spend 30 plus hours on this project and then I got to go back and work 40 more hours to get my job done? That's not sustainable, and that can't happen again. And so we have to put a lot of effort into making sure that we provide those resources back to the departments. In fact, we've already talked to the state procurement office to do a vendor list for us so that we can find accounting firms that have the ability to be that augmentation, right? To be deployed into the department so that the accounting work, right, that's being done out there can continue to be performed.
So what's the current volume on the current system today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wanted to know that. I asked our team to go back and take a look. How many transactions, do we process on a monthly basis? And what is the value of those 75,000 transactions a month hit Famous. That's the existing 55-year-old system built on a language that's not even taught in school anymore. 75,000 transactions. The value of those transactions, $2.6 billion in value. That's incredible. A month on average. Okay, that's an average, all right? So we process 70, I was shocked when I heard this, 75,000 checks are processed a month. 75,000. 10,000 of them are payroll checks. So
Vendors for the rest.
so 65,000 vendors, about 10. These are average numbers. So, but it's incredible how much volume is going through this system that's,
Paper-based.
yeah, no, it's true because again, like I mentioned, you know, the process that we had already been in place for 50 years before Famous was created 55 years ago, right? And so it really just took that paper-based process, moved some of it into a database, essentially, like a bookkeeping database, which is what Famous really is. And then, you know, now here we are today, trying to figure out, okay, how can we really do it better? And how can we ensure that, you know, the system continues to be updated so that we're ahead of any cybersecurity issues, so that we're not dealing with any, you know, missed upgrades, right? You know, and things like that are going to naturally happen with modern systems that we're familiar with. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but when you guys are talking about that whole thing with OCM, I really just felt like it would be important for me to, you know, kind of share some of the stuff that we're
I think we also
doing.
need a plan, and it sounds great.
It is a plan, and it's a plan that we're working
We'd
through.
like to see the plan.
Well, I mean, the plan is being actually executed on right now. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm happy to provide something to you, Vice Chair. But yeah, it's happening. We're already doing it.
So where are you? So
Oh,
maybe we can move
I'll let you get
along.
back. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll go back.
Well, just one last thing. OCM, Operations Change Management, is about dedicated people, but it's also about the right people. So the former BNF director always reminded me that this is a financial system. And where are the CPAs? Thankfully, he's one. And so qualified people that are dedicated is a lesson learned. And thankfully, even though he was busy doing everything under the sun during COVID, he took it upon himself to get involved in the project. So
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Craig, maybe if you can come up.
So what was your function? Oh,
Good afternoon,
go ahead.
Chair, Vice Chair. I'm Craig Hirai, the Executive Assistant at the Hawaii Housing Finance and Development Corporation and the former Director of Finance during the last 3 years of the EA administration. And I'm a CPA.
So is that like we've asked the former comptroller, can you tell us what your role is functioning and what you saw as the problem and what could be improved?
Well, like I said, I have a bias because I am an accountant. But
Well, that would help in this system.
yes. And it's an accounting system, yes. But we're basically a user. I mean, BNF is basically a user again. And we were very much interested in certain applications. And so, you know, we were very much wanting to get Famous online so we could apply our applications to that system. And that was our interest, basically, as a user. And looking back on it, in terms of when they were talking about the RFP system, I think maybe we didn't dig deep enough into the vendors, when, you know, as to whether or not they could indeed do what we needed or we wanted. So that was something that was a problem. And again, I go back and say that it's an accounting system, and there just not enough trained accountants, CPAs in the state government, or probably in any agency that I know of. And the ones that we do have are busy. I mean, they've got their normal work to do, and sometimes even more. And and sometimes they're the CFO, and they really have other responsibilities. And some of us have been CPAs for almost 50 years, and we had other jobs to do, like being director of finance. So,
But if in fact this is going to change how we do business, and it's really critical for the state, what do you see then can we do if we don't have enough CPAs, or CPAs that we do have other responsibilities? What do you see if, looking back on that problem, how do we solve it going forward? Because if we don't have the CPAs, or at least people knowledgeable, then we're in the same place, because
Well, I
you're
think-
not putting the right scope of work into the contract.
I think, what the Comptroller Reagan said has some merit, getting, getting outside support, consulting support, well, outside support, I don't even know if it's consulting, but just outside help that's trained in accounting has some, that would help take the pressure, relieve some people of some of the daily functions they have to do so they can dedicate more time to the project. The other thing is, I think, that, and maybe having some people at some level just dedicated to going around and making sure all the applications are considered from all of the departments. Because you've got to be able, I think, in terms of change management, somebody, probably my bias again, is probably need a trained accountant to say, okay, we can do it this way. We don't have to do it that way. This way is better, and that sort of thing. But it'll get things done that we need done in the system.
So that's done after you get the vendor, or in the scoping of the RFP to get the vendor?
When we started using, a lot of stuff came, just personally, when they started live training, I guess, on the system, a demo project, a lot of things come to mind as to, in terms of change management and things like that. And, you're trying to see where things go, and you want to see what the reports are and things like that come out, because accounting systems are basically, simplistically, you've got cash receipts, cash disbursements, and your trial balance, and pretty much everything else builds off of that, exponential, large numbers, but it's a basic system. And like I say, and that's the sort of thing that, you need to be able to get back to, because your financial statements and everything else, like the ACFR, comes off of that basic system also.
Is there sort of a template? You say, this is what we
Well-
need, and that the vendor has to say, we're going to be able to
I think we're, no, sorry.
work with that.
I think Mr. Odaguru was saying, the chart of accounts is where I think we started that time. And, so long as it gets the basics done, that's probably okay. But it's getting people, if you're going to do change management and you're going to change the system, somebody's got to be, the professional user's got to say, yeah, this is okay. And just then you've got to train people how to use it. But somebody's got to make the call that, it's okay.
So that's on the front end.
Yeah.
When you're doing the scope.
Well, and also it helps to see what their existing systems do in hindsight.
So the relationship between what OETS does and what you as a functioning agency, not functioning agency, but as a function agency, what is that relationship, and how can we make sure that there's a good tie-in? Because it's basically the user has to do it, but I see OETS as kind of the staff agency to make sure that the technology is in sync with what the user needs. So what is that connection
Well, I think
that you think was
the
missing?
comptroller is on the right track. You just have to talk to a lot of, talk to the end users up front, and see what they need. And then, and on top of that, maybe say, okay, well, what are you, these are what, this is what the SAP system did last time. Do you think that's workable? Can you train your people to use that? And just one more thing, I think, which I think Doug covered, Mr. Murdoch covered too, is that I think toward the end there, for the things we need, it has to do with data recovery. toward the end there, I think it became more evident that in our particular case, for things like bond tracking, we need to go backward. We need to retrieve old data. And that became an issue too. And I think they're going to address that at the beginning now, not at the end. How do we get at old data? And, you know.
That's an ETL. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Doug, could you come back, please? Next slide. Next slide.
We go to slide 11, I think. So we have here a list of some of the things that we're doing right now. We're continuing to develop and deploy the quality assurance plan that we have, which has 39 different elements to it. It has things that we're already doing like IV&V and things that we want to add like phase gates during implementation. ETS manages or aids in the development of every new system the state has. So we've been very involved in unemployment insurance, and we were involved in payroll and time and leave, and every other system. We provide expert advice, you know, on many, many things, including program management. And we review all the IV&V reports. Normally, we're the contracting agency and the department pays for the report, but so that the report can be independent, you know, we try and be the contracting agency, and we work with the IV&V companies. And we need to provide them with more standards on how they do their reports, and we've got a plan working for that.
And you're adding in where they tell you, you know, the triggers, hey, red means do something.
Yeah, I think what we want to say to them is green means everything's good. Yellow means there's an acceptable risk. It's something that it'd be better if they fix it, but they probably can go forward with it. Red means it's an unacceptable risk that they're probably going to fail if they don't fix it. And right now, that's not the way it is. Right now, red just means we're not happy with it. So we have to make sure they're sending us the message that we need to do something, and then we can talk to the department, you know, and I've already sent a couple notes to departments about things that I know should be in that unacceptable category to say, start taking contract action, because you don't want to be in a position where you're all red and you've taken no contract action to back up whatever termination you wanted.
Have you put into place, and I guess we're all nice people, right? We don't want to hurt people's feelings, or we don't want to say anything, but is there something that can be pretty straightforward, that if it's red, this, you tell them the next, and you terminate them? I mean, at some point, somebody has to make a tough decision that this ain't going anywhere, I better terminate. But we don't have that, and people want to adjust and help them and give them more money.
Right.
Right? So is there something that you can even put in the IV&V contracts?
Can you go to slide 14? So this is the plan. And here you can see the green, yellow, red, reds being unacceptable risks. And then we have over there contract actions that we recommend the department make when they get to red. So I think it'll be easier for them to do that once they're declared red, I think, and we need to support them on that. So we're going to try and create this trigger. There may be reasons why they still don't want to do that. Maybe they want to negotiate and try and fix it first, but we're just, at least we'll have a recommendation out there that, you know, you should take contract action here to put them on notice. And then
And you're going to make like some kind of template letter for the departments to send out so that
right.
they're clear on what they're saying.
Yes,
and
Senator.
see if somebody helps them.
We're going to create a little guidebook for that. And then if you could go to the next slide, one more maybe. Oh, sorry. We have a risk scoring chart. Yep, that's it. So I think it's also important that they look at likelihood and consequence when they're doing risk scoring. And I think this is what's not happening now. And this is something from my Air Force background that we did on projects that, you know, we look at how likely is it and how consequential is it. And it might be really likely, but of minor consequences shouldn't be read. And that's what we're going to look at is, okay, let's look at those upper, you know, the things that are scoring 20 or 25 points, you know, as causality, and say, okay, these are the things that need contract action. They're too serious to accept.
So that's once you get into the contract. I'm looking at the front end for the RFP and the kinds of safeguards you put into the contract, so that it's clear to the vendor as well, and to the department, because I think a lot of times the departments want it now, and say do a lot of without due diligence. So in terms of the department seeing, okay, if you go with this contract, it's X amount of dollars, you get no more. So you really have to be careful on the front end rather than rushing in and then having,
Right.
problems.
I think there's something we need to do with the procurement code in this area. And that is right now under the HAR for contracts for goods and services and construction. We can't have a negotiated procurement. Like in the federal system, FAR Part 15 is negotiated procurement or negotiated contract, where we can go back and forth and write a contract based on everything that happened in the process. But under the under the HAR 3-122, it says you cannot negotiate, you must accept a BAFO or not accept a BAFO. So there's not a middle ground where I can sit and negotiate off of a BAFO.
The front end.
Right, until I get another BAFO. So I would have to have 8 or 9 BAFOs.
What's a baffle?
BAFO is best and final offer.
Oh, okay, final
So
offer.
we put out a request for proposals. They give us their offer. Then we say, okay, we need you all to look at this issue and give us a new, and it's called your best and final offer. And we're not supposed to do more than that, but we can if we need to. We can do 2 BAFOs or 3 BAFOs, but to really get to a good negotiated contract, we would have to do 6 or 7 or 8 BAFOs probably. So I think we need to have some flexibility, and there is some flexibility, more flexibility in Health 103F than there is in 103D, but I would argue for even more flexibility where we can, on these really complicated contracts, like, these IT contracts, we really should have a very well negotiated contract to go forward. And I think we can put in more language like you're suggesting if we have a little more control. We do put in language just to try and clear up the confusion over what's the controlling language, because sometimes the vendor will say, well, that was in my first BAFO, but it wasn't in my second BAFO, or I put it in my BAFO even though it conflicts with the RFP. And so we have language in our contract that says, we accept your BAFO unless it's inconsistent with the RFP. But I would rather negotiate that inconsistency and get rid of it and not have an argument later.
You should have just one contract that you can look at and say,
Right.
this is what's required.
So if you tried to read through the contract and all the documents that make up the contract, it's very hard. And I don't think it's certainly not a best practice. The federal government doesn't do it that way. You do have to train your contracting officers and people to be able to do it, but I think it's a better practice too. And I think sometimes it happens even though it's not supposed to. So
have you brought this up to the SPO?
we did just have a discussion, and we're going to have some more. I mean, they're very concerned about ensuring that all of the vendors get treated equally. But in the federal system, when you are selected as the lead vendor in an RFP process, that gives you the right to negotiate a contract. It doesn't give you the award of the contract. But in the state system, when you are accepted as the vendor in whichever BAFO level you're at, that's an award.
So these discussions, this started when, was this recent discussions with the SPO?
We've had discussions before with them about this.
Was this something that you guys considered for possible legislation for this year that maybe you guys just didn't finalize or what have you? Because again, based on what we've gone through, maybe this was something that should have been considered for this session.
It would have been good. It just didn't come to me until a few days ago when I was thinking I need to go back and look at the FAR and see why I'm unhappy with the state contracting process. So I will say it's just a recent reminder in my mind of how we did things, because there was full negotiation on a lot of contracts like this that have a lot of requirements and complexity to them. So we can do better, and it'll have to be in next year, I'm afraid, but
Put enough guardrails so the SPO is happy, but it seems like you need one contract and everybody can see one contract. I tried looking through all the documents you said, and like where is this?
It's very difficult.
Well, guardrails too, because every time we touch procurement code, people start to, have strong feelings, people start to freak out,
That's right.
right?
So I think on the health side, on 103F, it says, it's okay to do more negotiation as long as it doesn't cause a significant change. And they define a significant change as anything that might have changed the scoring of the RFP. So I think that's a pretty good guardrail. And if we had that on the 103D side, that would be a good start.
At least there's precedent.
Right. That would be my thought, that, if we could just start with that, it would give us some more leeway to negotiate. I think it's much better than having the contract system we have now.
So Doug, can we go back to slide 11?
11, yes.
Some of the recommendations, and maybe just highlight certain ones that you feel should be considered for the future.
I will, thank you. Building the minimum viable product, which is probably better called the initial operating capability. We always try and build the smallest system we can to start with and then add to it. So in this case, replacing Famous and then adding things to there, like the department systems after that, is really the ideal way to make sure that the contractor knows what they're doing and we know what we're doing and we can come to an agreement. If you try and build the whole thing all at once, you way raise your risk of failure. So we like to do that. We, at one time, were trying to create the entire ERP for the state, which would have been HR, payroll, time and leave and accounting in one big procurement. And I was actually comptroller when we stopped that effort and said, okay, we're going to do them one at a time, payroll and HR, time and leave. And that's what we've been doing successfully. And I think this is what we're doing. So I think right now the executive committee is in agreement that we'll try and go this way with the minimum, with the initial operating capability.
The total end product is that you connect up all the departments. So what the comptroller is saying they're doing, at least talking with all the departments, that your small system still is capable of connecting up with all the departments. Is that correct?
That's correct. So what you could do, for example, is build the replacement for Famous and a replacement for all the paper forms, so that there's no more paper forms, everything gets put in electronically, and also put in the interfaces, because interfaces exist now between Famous and the departments where they feed data into the Famous system. So we would redo those interfaces, and we probably would, as part of that, have the interfaces change from the department's chart of accounts to the state chart of accounts automatically until they convert over to the new system.
They're that different from what departments do and what the state.
For the most part, I would say, yeah. So that's the idea there. And then we recommended shifting the funding or sponsorship of the ERP to the comptroller as the primary business owner. And I think that's a smart thing to do. Standardizing the IV&V reporting for everybody. I have shown you a little bit of that. And then creating an IT vendor management office and ETS to support all the departments, I think would be helpful. We probably should have an IT contract trained lawyer available to us all the time to help all the departments. So we'll work on that. It's so important to be always watching. I mean, part of what a lawyer's job is just to learn what's going on now, and there's all kinds of intellectual property issues and termination issues and things like that we need to make sure we take care of. Ownership of data is huge right now, and in terms of making sure we own our data. So these are some of the recommendations. I think there might be more that we've talked about. Can we go to the next page? Requiring vendors to have key staff in Hawaii. This didn't happen with LSI, and we've always done that, but we didn't do that in this contract because we were in the middle of the pandemic. But I think the program manager and probably their OCM manager and a couple other people, maybe their functional manager, should be living in Hawaii here with us and knowing what we're going through and have, their feet in the sand. So we want to see that happen. A lot of change management effort, which is happening right now. We're way ahead on that. And then outsourcing the skill positions, backfill positions that Keith talked about, and then setting up review gates to go forward. There are more than this, and there's a couple more slides later on where we talk about, for example, what the IV&V recommended. So we have a long list of things we can do better. These just happen to be the biggest impact things that will reduce the risk and make this project successful.
Okay, so Doug, there's 30 more slides. Yeah, so maybe you can pick one or two more because I think Budget and Finance Director really wants to come up and
Yeah,
share.
I know, he's
us.
getting antsy, he wants to speak.
Oh. Maybe just one or two more, please, Doug.
Sure. Could we go to page 20? I did just want to point out that in the last RFP, there was a big evaluation committee made up of lots of people. So a lot of people, they would have had to review the RFP, look at the parts that were important to them. So there were 18 people from DAGS, 15 from BNF, including 2 voting members, 1 voting member from DAGS, 1 voting member from ETS, which is required as the contract administrator, 1 voting member from UH, 2 people reviewing, and then 1 person from Department of Health kind of representing the departments. So
UH doesn't even belong to your system.
no, but it was Garrett Yoshimi,
Okay.
who's, you know, an expert, a truly qualified expert. So we did have a lot of people, you know, in the evaluation of the vendor. And then if we go to the next slide, I think we have, this was the selection committee. So actually DAGS had 2 members. So we had a good evaluation committee, and I think we just, it was pandemic. I think the vendor was impacted by the pandemic. I think the vendor was impacted by their failure in Nevada, you know, which is about when we started. I mean, they did not do well right from the beginning, and Keith is right about that. Or I think Kurt was saying, you know,
Was there no other vendor that seemed promising?
We had other vendors, including one that we were successful with in the past. And if in hindsight, you know, probably ought to go with the champion, right? Just like the Chiefs, you got to go with the champion.
Even if
Sorry.
you have to pay more, you can
Strike
get
that
more.
from the record. Just kidding.
Yeah, no,
Not kidding.
I feel that way too. But, you know, it's hard to go against champs. So, I mean, if you have successful vendors that have done things for you in the past, you probably, it's hard to get off that horse. And I hope they come back and bid this time, you know. I part of what I do in my role as CIO is I talk to vendors. I talk to them when they come to Hawaii. I tell them sometimes I won't talk to them unless they come to Hawaii and unless they have local partners that they're going to work with, because I want to see that, you know, they have a relationship. Also, when I go to IT conferences, I spend a lot of time with vendors, in this case, encouraging them to bid on the unemployment insurance contract, which we're working through right now, or encouraging them to bid on the future EFS projects. So I'm always doing vendor management and, you know, being ready to be a good broker of services to the state, so that if somebody calls me and says, I need this, I can say, okay, these guys can do that for you, and probably other people too. And I walk them through the process of how they can find a successful solution to their problem. So to me, you know, my job is really to help departments create business capability using IT as a tool, and I'm not here just for the technology. That's not really my role. It's about business capability, and that's everything ETS does, is providing business capability to the state.
Thank you. Thank you, one very much.
Yeah. Oh, sure. You want to come up and speak? You waiting? You want to speak? Okay.
You know, maybe if you,
Finance.
if Comptroller would join me too as well.
Okay,
I
sure.
think,
And we want to hear from Todd too, so you're not
oh
giving
yeah,
up.
so we'll be quick. Thank you very much.
Because we're the functionaries,
Vice Chair.
they're the functionaries.
Yeah, I think, you know, of all of the things that Doug talked about and what you've heard about in terms of the lessons learned, as well as our path going forward, in many ways, you know, this effort has literally been going on since literally 2012. I mean, the original intent of moving and upgrading the state's financial management system literally started back 3
The
administrations
dream,
ago.
you mean, the dream part.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And so, you know, this whole process and how and where we are to this day, I mean, there's been a lot of effort that's been put into this thing. And, you know, coming back in this particular case, and when Keith and I came on board, I mean, three months into, you know, our tenure and our roles, you know, there was a significant recognition that this project had serious concerns. And, you know, we did the yeoman's job of trying to see what could be done to try and, you know, rewrite this, this ship. But I think it became apparently clear that we needed to basically, you know, make that significant call. And it was a hard call. It was an absolute hard call to make. We both Keith, Doug, and I, you know, we basically struggled over it for a couple of weeks.
The question that came up in Ways and Means was that if they weren't performing according to the scope of their contract, why couldn't we have clawed back some of the $8 million on this contract, or any contract? You know, at some point you say, hey, you're not doing the job that you said you were going to do. So when we terminate, you don't get to keep all the money.
I
didn't. I mean, like
yeah. The decision on termination for convenience was one that was made as a consensus within the group. You know, in a very simple way, you know, with the way I approached it, a project, it doesn't matter if it's an IT project, if it's a construction project, if it's a bridge, it represents, you know, 3 different components: scope, schedule, and budget. And there was a recognition that the scope, as it was being, you know, as it was when the RFP was going out, really there was still something that there was a misalignment in terms of expectations for the scope. So the idea that somehow somebody was at fault, I think there, in many ways, nobody was innocent in this particular case. And, you know, going through the process of trying to claw it back, and not at that point in time, not knowing the, you know, the full breadth of all of the different things that had transpired in the 2 years prior to us coming on board, you know, it was really difficult for Keith and I to make that decision. We just knew one thing. We knew that this project needed to stop in its current state, and that needed to happen. And that's when the call was made. So, you know, I think there's a lot that can be, you know, figured out. I've been a significant proponent on taking a look at to Doug's point, how the state contracts, you know, the way we develop our contracts and the way we manage our contracts, I believe is an area of significant improvement that the state needs to make. And in many ways, this project and what Keith, and now that Keith has taken on that significant sponsorship role of this, has really kind of driven that point home. We are doing everything we can in order to establish the right requirements, make sure that we do the contract that we enter into is ironclad. Because I'm gonna Monday morning quarterback this thing, but there were things, and I think, you know, and I'm not laying any blame, it was a difficult time. There was COVID going on. You didn't have people that were here. In hindsight, maybe issuing a very large procurement project during the height of a pandemic might not necessarily have been the right thing to do. But I think that there was a desire to really do it because it was something that needed to happen. So to that point, in keeping my remarks brief, what we're doing right now, taking the recommendations of the IV&V, putting the accountability where the accountability should lie, and in many ways putting that on the comptroller, and budget and finance being, I would say we don't own the system, but we're probably its biggest client as well as its biggest super user. So we have vested interest in it. And so, you know, obviously BNF, from a money perspective, we want to make sure that the money is being spent correctly, and we want to make sure that the information and the system that gets developed is going to be one that the state can use. So I think
so you're a user, so you are part of this user group that is created or has created the RFP already.
No,
the
it's
scope
in
of
process.
it's
in process, or
so there's
so
the executive
a
steering
BNF part
committee.
and there's a DAGS part. I mean, if I would.
So BNF, again, there's a recognition right now that the system of record, which is the general ledger, the accounting records, is owned by the comptroller. We, as budget and finance, need that information. But what we provide from a budgetary standpoint is we provide the parameters around which the accounting system will operate. Like we say, you know, the budget system says you have $100, the accounting system will tell you this is how you spent that $100. And trying to make it extremely simple in terms of from that perspective.
But you do bonds too, and they don't necessarily
We
do
don't.
bonds.
Yeah. So the bonds
So how
issue
does
is
that's a separate.
so it's separate, but it needs information because it needs expenditure information. And the reason why bonds was brought up, and in fact, during the procurement process for this last project, essentially bonds, if I'm not mistaken, was originally part of a subsequent phase, but was brought forward because of compliance requirements with the IRS. And what we needed to do in order to make sure that we could continue to track the utilization of bond proceeds in order to make sure that we have compliance on our tax exempt status. That's why that portion of the project got moved up. There were significant amount of discussions that happened in terms of like, okay, how do we make sure that the system that was going to get established needed to have it? And I think those were some of where the misalignments happened, because there were expectations, I think, from the vendor, well, this is what we were going to deliver. And then there was expectations from BNF as well, this is what we need. And then when the two came together and it wasn't, then a lot of things just kind of like, okay, well, what's happening?
That
So-
came late in the game, though. instead of in the
That
front end.
was, that came, after the project was issued, after the vendor came on board. This is just my observation, but it almost seemed like the vendor was already selected, but then requirements were being developed after the vendor was even selected because of a misalignment from the establishment of the requirements in the beginning of this. And again, I mean, I'm not
No,
what
but I
you
think
call it's
we're
just a
trying to
matter.
see how can we correct it in the future so that those vendor requirements are upfront with all the users. And then when they come in, it's not after the fact, so we can correct it upfront.
Yeah. So, and that's where Keith has really stepped up in the past year that we've been, for this administration, and really kind of taking that aspect, because it's a lot. The accounting system is a lot harder. And to say this from a budgeting perspective, there's really only one way you budget, right? And you got to make sure you do it the correct way, or else your request's not going to be in the budget. But there's accounting methodologies that would change with GASB proponents. That you have departments that have different types of regulatory accounting, reports that they need to do. There are multiple different ways where accounting happens, but there's only one way to do a budget, which is in many ways, to Doug's point, one of the reasons why the budget system is now being bifurcated from the EFS project, because those two things can essentially happen mutually exclusively. You can have a budgeting system in anticipation of an accounting system. You can have an accounting system and then, develop a budgeting system. So to that point, I'll keep my remarks short, but we're pushing forward. Chair, Vice Chair, Keith is on the job, and I'm here to support him 100% on it.
Yeah, and I think what I'd also like to add is that, and I appreciate Doug sharing sort of his thoughts on what we need to do differently, right? Those slides that he kind of walked through, we agree 100% with what he shared on those slides, especially about making sure that the functional area, in this instance, DAGS with accounting, has the responsibility of the funding, as well as the responsibility of some of the resources that come along with the funding. I think that's really critical. In fact, just recently, a bill was heard, I believe it was in your committee, a joint committee with GVO, where there was an allowance or a modification to HRS 266 that would give us the opportunity to have exempt positions, specific types of exempt positions, very narrow in terms of what those could be, that would help us to set up a project management office within the comptroller's office, specifically to help move this project forward, so that the responsibility, while it's on my shoulders, I also have the resources to be able to carry that out and make sure it gets across the finish line.
Any other questions?
No, I'd like to hear IV&V.
And
And we have few minutes.
we have 5 minutes left, so.
And so Doug can close,
And there's no room to extend. We've used up all of our grace
Understood.
the last 2 weeks, so you have 5 minutes.
Good afternoon,
Oh,
Chair
four, and then you
Aquino.
have
or
1
less.
minute.
We go to slide 38.
Yeah.
Oh, slide
afternoon.
38.
Back one, please. Sorry, we want the one with the circles on it. There you go. Oh, there you go, right there. Thanks. You can talk to this.
So this is coming straight from Barry Dunn, the IV&V vendor for this project. And as Doug mentioned, typically you want to start it earlier, like right before or as right on time. Sorry, my name is Todd Omura, IT governance officer. I work for Doug. Part of my responsibility is the IV&V program, and actually on this solicitation procurement for the IV&V vendor, I was actually running it. So just totally underestimated the length of time it takes to get somebody on board. Bottom line, we were very happy on how they performed. They came in late, about 5-6 months. The first report was, I think it was about September. So they got into the project around the June timeframe. By that time, they were seeing a lot of issues. And again, these were consistent, the slide you're seeing, pretty much throughout the project and the big rocks on why they felt just, ended the way it did. And, the comptroller and Doug and Director Salivera, they actually talked about a lot of these things that would happen. And also Kurt too as well, and Mr. Arai.
And this really informs what we're trying to fix.
Yeah.
So if you look at these things, you're gonna say, oh yeah, that's why they're doing that. Oh yeah, that's why they're doing that. And it also kind of shows.
When those occurred, we didn't do anything though. We just said, oh, okay, interesting.
When they occurred,
Yeah.
well, we were taking action on everything, trying to make it better, but
It was too late in the contract.
what can you do? At some point, you're too far down the road.
Yeah, and some of these observations that you can see it's almost by time, like the last couple ones where we tried engaging consultants to kind of make up for the gap, and they kind of, in the end, it's like, well, you can't do that. That needle goes too far to the right, then it's not good. And turnover, as time goes by, turnover on the state side and the contractor side starts to affect the project too.
And we were in a difficult time with the hiring freeze and then reduction of positions. And so, trying to correct some of these things required more people, and we didn't have it. So we would try and work through how we could fix it. But we will definitely fix everything here going forward. And we're really committed to, on every project, not just this one, help the departments be successful. It kills us when one doesn't work out right.
It would be helpful to have your plan of your procedures, primarily in terms of how you do RFP, and go all the way down to the IV&V. That if in fact they should be at the same time that your vendor starts it, it really needs some action beforehand so that you have the vendor and the IV&V at the same time.
We really want the IV&V to help us even look at the RFP as we're drafting it. So we're working toward that, that kind of standard. And I think we had that on unemployment insurance as part of that process. Is a lesson learned is, let's get they have an IT lawyer on that project. They had an IV&V very early on that project. So that's the first project that's gotten the lessons learned from this project, and it'll happen on every other one.
So you have an attorney on board, or you contract with?
Not on board, it's a contract attorney. So a special deputy attorney general.
Anything else you want to add?
The next slide too is actually their next. This is coming from the IV vendor, and it's basically a repeat of what all the gentlemen talked about. That what's happening now. So taking the recommendations to heart, moving forward, getting ready for this next round.
Okay, so where are we on the contract going forward?
So right now, we're awaiting funding for the project. If we get funding, then we will do an RFP working with an IV&V contractor, and we have Gartner and THG and some other folks helping us, Infotech. So we'll get a lot of help, a lot of eyes on it. We're doing a lot of work right now through Spire with the departments and with DAGS accounting. BNF is working with GFOA and Barry Dunn actually on their requirements. So we're doing a lot of preparation work right now to be ready next summer. to start the procurement
So
process.
where are you in the budgeting bit? In
So
30 seconds.
in 30 seconds, the budget system, we are working towards having an RFP issued by the end of March.
Okay, and you have funding for it.
We have funding for it. We still have some of the original money that was programmed during.
How much is that? Yeah. How much?
We don't know. We have set aside about 7 for that. We don't think that it's going to come in that high, but again, I don't want to speak too soon. It
And
depends
this
on
is
the
the
requirements.
70 or 7.
Huh?
How much?
This is just for this is just for the budget system.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
So again,
And
we
that's only
have
one small
bifurcated.
part of the.
We've bifurcated the accounting project
Okay.
from the budgeting project. And in many ways, again, the budgeting side is, and that's the stuff that you guys use. So it's an important aspect because that's really going to frame, more the planning side than the transactional side, which is what
Yes,
Keith is
dot-com
responsible for, right? So we are, our plan right now, our timeline and our critical path is that we expect to have we're in RFP development right now. This week, we're actually sitting down with our procurement support consultant to actually develop those requirements. We are literally going through over 1,036 individual requirements and making a determination on whether or not they're critical, desired. We want to have that done within the next 2 weeks so that we can have the RFP issued by February, let out, and potentially have a vendor on contract by, probably in the summer, and basically take our time. So the next budget cycle will be a biennium, so it's not a good time to actually do a new budgeting system. So what we plan on having is that we'll have the budget system up and running by the time that the next supplemental budget comes in, which would be in 2026. Yes.
All right. Well, we just want to thank everyone for attending. Went a little over 90 minutes, but this is very good discussion, really to truly understand, what had happened. There's a number of concerns still that I feel that need to be addressed. It's good that there are plans to reduce risk and moving forward and lessons learned. So I think having said that, should there be a need for a future briefing, we will let everyone know. But I think this was a very healthy discussion. I just want to thank everyone. Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Long weekend.
We're adjourned.
Thank you.